Welcome everyone to another episode of Kiwi Talks. My guest today is a well-known game composer who has composed for games like Mass Effect, 007 Bloodstone, Alice in Wonderland, and the recent Guardians of the Galaxy. I'd like to welcome Richard Jacques. How you doing?
Hey Reese, good to be with you.
Yeah. I'm really looking forward to this because big fan of your music, so I'm looking forward to this chat. So I thought I'd start off with Guardians of the Galaxy, of course, since that is your most recent work, which is a brilliant soundtrack, by the way. I think it's actually some of your best work.
Thank you very much.
So in terms of the musical palette for it, how did you come up with that?
Well, right from the beginning, myself and Steve Szykowski, who's the senior audio director at Eidos Montreal, the developers of the game, we both wanted to create a sort of huge, epic, intergalactic sounding soundtrack, if you will. So I chose to have a full symphony orchestra with choir for some specific sections of the game, and also there are some synth elements as well, so some analog synthesizers and some electronic percussion and things like that. So those elements were going to combine to form my palette for the game and the soundtrack in terms of the elements, and then it was down to how I was going to utilize those forces and how I was going to score the game by using those kind of elements.
Right. So was there much direction in terms of from the audio director? What's his name? Steve Szykowski?
Steve Szykowski is the senior audio director.
Yeah.
Steve Szykowski, yeah. And from the beginning, we knew that we wanted to create a sort of a classic epic Marvel experience that you would expect from a Guardians game. We wanted the player to feel empowered when they're doing well in combat, to get the heroic theme coming through like you would in an MCU film. So it was important for us to try and achieve that with the score. We didn't just want to have sort of arbitrary background music. We wanted the score to play a really big part in the game, whether it was to do with themes we're using for characters or certain locations that the player may visit. The use of themes is a really important part of the Guardians soundtrack. So right from the beginning, I composed what we call the hero theme, which is the Guardians' main theme, which does play throughout the score, sometimes subtly, sometimes in more poignant moments, sometimes in heroic sections or combat, and that sort of formed the backbone of the score. And then we used a couple of other main themes for some of the characters that you might come across, some of the villains especially, which I won't give away any spoilers for those who haven't played it yet. But that was our sort of key idea of how the score would unfold. And then there are, of course, some sort of dramatic underscore sections. And as I said, there are some sort of more poignant moments as well in the score. So those were our kind of building blocks.
So in terms of the hero theme, how long did that take you to compose? The da, 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 da.
Oh, I'm glad. You're the first person that's done that to me since then. I'm mightily impressed. So thank you for that, Reese. It's good to know it's memorable. Right from the beginning, that was the first piece of music I wrote, actually, way back in 2017.
Oh, wow, quite a while ago.
Yeah, quite a while ago now. And that's when Eidos Montreal contacted me for the game, and they were evaluating some composers' work. They'd heard some of my music on, I think, specifically Mass Effect and 007 Bloodstone, and thought I'd be a good sort of fit for the project. So there was a sort of round of demos with some other composers, and I wrote the hero theme then. It took about probably a couple of hours, something like that, 2 or 3 hours. When I'm composing themes like that, I tend to do it away from my studio. I know every composer has their own sort of tricks and their own way of doing things. I find sometimes being in the studio and having all the technology around you can be distracting. So I often just go for long walks, or depending on what I'm doing, I always think about it in my head first, and it comes to me, and then it sort of starts to form, and then I sort of scribble it down on a piece of paper or sing it into my phone or something, and then I go into my studio and start orchestrating it and arranging it in full orchestral version. So that was the first thing I wrote. It probably took about from beginning to end, maybe 3 or 4 hours, something like that. And I orchestrated it out fully to give a sort of 1 minute 20-second version of that, and that actually was completely unchanged and is in the game right now. So yeah, that's a really sort of satisfying part of the process where you write a theme, and Steve at Eidos Montreal said that was why they chose me, because that theme just combined all the elements that you would find in the Guardians. You know, it doesn't take itself too seriously, but it's got a sense of adventure. It's exciting, and I wanted to pack all those things into this theme. You know, it's fun, all these kind of elements, and that was what I was thinking about when I was creating that main theme.
Did you write it and think, yes, I've nailed it after you wrote it?
That's a really good question. I guess so. I mean, everyone has their own sort of opinions on how a theme should go, especially for Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. And this was my take on it, if you like, my approach. When I had finished it, I thought, that's how I see it. Yeah, that's my take on it. I see this as a big sort of classic superhero theme, which suited the Guardians very well, and you would expect to hear in a Marvel game or film. So I was happy with it, and I thought I'd sort of done my best, and that's all we can do. But I thought it had legs, as they say. You know, you could reuse that theme throughout the game in different disguises, and that's exactly what we ended up doing. So I knew it had the longevity that it needed. So yeah, I was satisfied when I finished doing it.
So when you were writing other pieces, were you writing them in the way where you could seamlessly incorporate that theme, or would you compose something and then be like, I'll incorporate the hero theme here?
I would think about it before I started a piece of music. So there were certain sections that we knew we wanted the player to feel empowered and that sense of superheroism. So before I would start something like that, I would think, okay, I'm going to incorporate the main theme here in a certain way. And also in some of the cinematic sequences, if there's a specific reference to the Guardians being together, I would think to myself, all right, I'm going to incorporate the theme here, but in a slightly different way, maybe a slightly softer way, for example, or a slower way. So I would consciously think about that before starting another piece of music. I wouldn't sort of write and compose another track and then think, I need to put the theme in here. It would be a conscious decision based on the sort of storytelling, and that's exactly how I approached it with other themes as well. You know, how is the narrative panning out? What's the player doing at this point in the story? Where do we need to emphasize thematic moments for characters or for planets you might explore, things like that. So it's more about the storytelling and using the themes to aid the narrative.
Right. And so with the end credits sequence, with the guitars and the drums, was that, how far in the process was that? Was that towards the end, or was that something you just thought out of a whim and just like, you know what, I'll just try this version with the guitars and drums?
Well, that was actually written at the same time as the main theme back in 2017.
Oh, and wow.
The reason for that is I knew at the time that our game in our Guardians universe would feature licensed music from the 80s. So as part of my demoing process, when I'd written the main theme, I just thought, let's do an 80s version with guitars. You know, what can go wrong? Just to sort of emphasize the fun element. And it was getting towards I guess it was probably about May or something of this year, and myself and Steve, the audio director, we were discussing, what should we do for the credits, and he showed me the sequence, and it was his decision to use that theme. So I then went and got it recorded with the orchestra and my guitarist. We wanted to give the player a reward, so that's why it combines guitars and drums, because they feature a lot in the licensed music and also in the original Star-Lord band tracks in the game. So it was kind of the perfect combination of having the main theme presented in a really fun and different way, but incorporating those elements from the other parts of the music in the game. So it was kind of a bit of a sort of 80s mashup, if you like.
Did you have much involvement in the licensing music and the Star-Lord music, or was that kind of handled by other people?
Yeah, so the Star-Lord band tracks were all composed by Steve Zwitkowski, the audio director of the game, and his writing partner, Johan Boudreau. They wrote and recorded and performed and created an entire rock album within the game. So a 10-track hard rock album just for the game itself, which is absolutely amazing to see the level of detail they went to, because Star-Lord in our universe is actually Peter Quill's favourite band, hence the reason for creating this whole album. That's why he has it on the back of his jean jacket, and there's this whole backstory that they went into, and Marvel absolutely loved the idea. So, a whole 10-track hard rock album within the game, and then the licensing side of things. So there's 31 licensed tracks from the 80s across all genres. That was coordinated and curated by Steve, and the actual licensing was done by Randy Eckhart of Eckhart Consulting, who also worked on a lot of the original Guitar Hero games. So he's very adept with dealing with record labels and band managers and things like that. So it all kind of came together in a really organic way. And with regards to the licensed music, I mean, how it integrates with the score, we actually took a lot of time and care to make sure that there's a seamless transition between the two, because we didn't want it to be a sort of needle drop moment where it's just something completely different and it could sound a bit disjointed for the player. So actually some of the score, whether it comes out of a piece of licensed music or whether the score precedes a piece of licensed music, we've been careful to match the same kind of key and tempo as the licensed track, so that there's a very smooth integration.
And did that stay relatively the same throughout? So you kind of knew where the licensed music was going to go, so you could compose around it? Or, because you know how game development works, right? Stuff changes all the time. So so you might compose something and be like, oh, no, this is going to be licensed music now. So was it quite seamless in how it was done? Or is it constant changing all the way through?
It was fairly seamless. As in, we knew where a piece of licensed music would go in the game. It wasn't a question of, 1 minute we think we're going to want score there, or 1 minute we're going to want a licensed track. But the one thing that did change quite a lot is which licensed track was actually in a specific area. So one minute it was one track, and then for both artistic reasons and maybe some licensing reason, that track would now be a different track. So I would actually have to change the key of the piece of music I'd written. The actual music composition was fine, and that remained in place. But 1 minute we had a rock track in E, and then we had a pop track in A, or something like that. So I'd have to change the key of my score. Luckily, this was done prior to recording, so it wasn't too much of a problem. But you're right; those things do kind of change. It's a bit of a fluid situation, so you have to be flexible in your approach. And we were keen to make those transitions work really well. So it was worth the extra work just to sort of make them really gel with one another.
When you do a whole key change, is it just as simple as just doing a whole key change to the piece that you've already written, or have you got to change certain elements?
It depends. Sometimes it can be as simple as that if it's a small key change, but if it's quite a large one, I have to then look at the orchestration of the range of the instruments, so that we're not going outside of them and make the music unplayable, and also where the individual instruments sit comfortably, where they sound natural, rather than taking them to the extremities in the upper or lower register. So it was really important that once in my software, I can press a button and almost as simple as that, but you can change the key quite easily. But then I have to go through every single instrument and make sure it's playable, make sure it's sounding right, and make sure the textures are correct. And things like that. So yeah, it's not a 5-minute job. It's probably a couple of hours to get that done and to make it work correctly. Because
would the orchestra be later on in the process? So would kind of all the tracks that you're implementing, right? That would just be kind of MIDI or demo tracks.
Exactly.
Yeah. So once it's actually set in stone, I mean, it wouldn't be a simple matter of just be like, hey, can we just get the orchestra again and record that piece?
No, that's right. I mean, with so much music to record for this game, we knew it was going to be a long session at the studio, so we had to lock those keys, and I had to make sure that the licensed music was absolutely final and wasn't going to change, because we had to lock that off and then go to the studio and record. And we recorded the orchestra back in June of this year. So yeah, we do have to make those decisions in a relatively decent amount of time, because of course scoring with an orchestra has huge amount of work to do. When I finished preparing the music, and like you said, I'm writing in Midi, in effect, with all my sample libraries. And then I have a whole team of people that then translate that into the printed music that the orchestra work from in Sibelius. So there's quite a big chunk of work that we had going almost round the clock from March right through until the end of June when we recorded. And I had a team of 12 people, which is the biggest I've had on the project, just because of the magnitude of this particular game.
Wow. So you were just working on this project the whole time? Because you know how sometimes musicians are all over the place in terms of you could be composing for 4 different games at the same time. But with this, were you focused solely on this?
Yeah, basically. I mean, I started the main bulk of the composition. We did a portion of one chapter for our vertical slice, which is where the whole game team takes a look at the sort of quality. This was back in September of 2018, and then I've been full-time on the project. And when I say full-time, I mean literally pretty much every day, very, very long days, since February 2019 it was. So and I wasn't working on anything else. There was no time. That, you know, over 5 hours of score is a huge amount of music to write. Yeah. So it is. So and with things changing and moving and COVID and all these curveballs that constantly kept coming my way. So it took up that time.
Curveballs. So did you take any influence from the Marvel films or the Guardians of the Galaxy films themselves?
No, not at all. I mean, I'm a big fan of the MCU, and I've watched them all, and I know a lot of the music, and I know some of the Guardians music. But this was basically Eidos Montreal's version of the Guardians of the Galaxy. Not the MCU, not the comics. They kind of took reference and inspiration from all things Guardians that have been around over the years. I was conscious that there was no themes that we needed to include because, you know, if, let's say, one of the Avengers suddenly pops up, which they don't, then we might have to look at using the Avengers theme. But this is a brand new original story, and therefore brand new original themes for the Guardians and for some of the other characters.
I wonder if they'll take your hero theme and incorporate it into the films now. Wouldn't that be cool?
We'll see. That would be incredibly cool.
Oh, it's a good thing to have on the resume, right?
I certainly wouldn't turn it down.
Yeah, because you've done television and a few films. Would you want to get back into that arena, or are you more focused on games?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it depends on the project, really. I mean, I'm drawn to projects with a really good, strong story. A lot of composers, I'm sure, would agree that music is part of the storytelling process. And that's what I loved about this game. I think the story is absolutely superb, and they've done an absolutely brilliant job on it. So that's why it's been such a pleasurable experience for me. Sure, give me an MCU. I'm ready. So bring it on.
All right. There we go. We'll have to put the word out for you then. So you mentioned earlier how sometimes you compose not in the studio. You don't compose in the studio. Is that partly because you have access to so much equipment and so many ways of composing that it can become quite convoluted or complicated as a result, and you want to simplify it?
I think there's some element of that. I can't really put my finger on why I do it that way, but in my own words, I would say that having too much kit around you can be distracting. Or you sitting in front of a screen in front of your DAW, you might, it's as if you have to fill in these blocks on the screen, and you have to fill them in now, kind of thing. I don't find that when you're doing a main theme, I don't find that approach works for me. I could probably just sit at a piano without any equipment and do it that way, but I find doing it in my head and sort of working out the shape, because it's often that I have the bare bones of it there, but it needs a slight tweak to get the shape. So quite often, once I've got the melody there in my head, I often write it out in a sort of very basic form of shorthand, just onto a scrap of paper, and then I might change the odd note or the odd rhythm here and there, and make sure it has a good shape to it, and then I'd put it into my sequencer, and then I can tweak it further if I want. But usually that's the only two sort of steps I take, really. I just find it I don't know, when you're in the studio, you can sort of feel the pressure and the sheer amount of music you have to write, and the main theme has to be, it has to be amazing and important and contain all the elements that a good theme should have. Longevity, as I said, I'm really keen on that. And I just find, walking around with it going around in my head without any distractions, without the phone ringing or having to reply to emails, those kind of things, I find that very kind of liberating, I guess is probably the right word. And I know some other composers do it that way as well. It depends on, some people start from an improvisation point of view, and that's how they come to their themes. It sort of depends on the individual, really, and what's the best thing that works for them.
Right. Because you know how there's obviously always new plugins coming out. Technology is constantly evolving, right? So do you always get tempted to get the next plugin and stuff like that? Or are you able to be content with the gear that you have?
I would say at the beginning of a project, I would maybe look at some new plugins and things like that. But once I've set on a course for that project, and I've sort of, it's mainly on the sort of more synths and percussion and those kind of things that I would probably change every project or update some new stuff. There's, how many orchestral libraries can one have? And, I've got pretty much all of them. And, I still find, sometimes you can just get so deep in that you take away from the actual music and the composition.
Well, that's right.
The one things I don't use is any sort of phrase-based orchestral libraries. That's not for me. That's I think those things are good for people on a really tight deadline. But if I know something's going to be played by a live orchestra, I've got to have all the notes in there. So I prefer to do it by hand, if you like, do it manually. But yeah, it's quite interesting. There was one quite interesting thing on this project, talking about plugins, that Heaviosity, the plugin manufacturer, who I know the guys there really well. They make some excellent stuff, and I had a Zoom with them probably 2 years ago now, and they wanted my input on what's now become Damage 2, and I said I wanted a bit more organic sounding, single hits and things like that. And the reason I did that is because there's one area of the game where I specifically wanted to use that. And of course, they did an incredible job on that. And I was able to use that in this exact level of the game. So it was almost like I'd ordered that specifically for chapter 11 in the game. So that's a really nice thing to do when you can actually, when you're invited to give some sort of feedback to developers saying what you would want from a product. I think it helps them. Maybe I use things in a way they hadn't thought, or maybe I want some sounds that they hadn't thought of. So it's really nice to have that sort of collaborative approach.
Because how do you find the mixing process? Because I've found when I've mixed music that it's quite easy to get and fall down the rabbit hole in terms of there's so many different ways to mix something, right? And particularly if you're using a plethora of plugins, it's very easy to do. So what's your way of avoiding that and staying focused?
Well, to be honest, I only really mix my demos. So if it's a huge orchestra recording, I get a very experienced mixing engineer. So Jake Jackson from Air Studios mixed the Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack here in my studio. It was an enormous mix, and he said it was the longest mix session he's ever done. We were mixing in Pro Tools and in 7.1 surrounds.
Wow.
So all the music's in 7.1, and there's also stems in 7.1. So there's multiple 7.1 stems. So it was a huge, I think there's 8 7.1 stems and a master 7.1 stem. So it's a huge, it's a huge mix. We decided to do it pretty much all in the box within Pro Tools itself. And we were using, our approach was not to go too crazy, because like if you've got some of the best musician in the world in one of the best studios in the world, and the music's well written, there shouldn't be any need to play around with it too much. So we were using some of the Cinematic Rooms plugins from Liquid Sonics and some of the Symphony 3D plugins just to get our surround reverbs, because there's not a huge amount of stuff out there at the moment for that configuration, although there's more coming onto the market. So yeah, there was, I think, I can't remember how many tracks we were running, but it was over 500. It was a huge mix.
It is a huge mix. Oh my
Yeah, with all
gosh.
the bussing and things like that, and choir and
So were you sitting in with him while he was mixing?
yeah,
Yeah. And giving him a pat on the shoulder and saying, sorry, I did this to you.
No, I mean, Jake's so good and experienced, and I love his approach because, you know, some people, like you're saying about the rabbit hole, I mean, I could probably do that myself and just keep putting plugins on and not really hearing much difference, things like that. But his approach is like, you know, cleaning up anything that has any issues, whether it's noise or pitch or anything like that, but then mainly just making it sound good. And he really made it sound excellent. And I wasn't sort of looking over his shoulder at all. I would let him get on with it, and then I'll come and check it at the end of each day and make a few minor adjustments, just balance adjustments really. But he made it sound huge, and you know, I think he did a great job. And you know, dealing with that many elements, and you know, and then a choir which we double tracked, and then a load of electronics, and then you know, things keep adding on top was quite a challenge for him, I think. But no, I'm absolutely delighted with the results.
Oh yeah, it sounds brilliant. Sounds brilliant on headphones and in speakers, which is
yeah, I've had to check it. I mean, when we were sort of finalising the mixes, and not only for the game but for the soundtrack, I remember I was literally checking it on everything. I was checking it on my headphones on the train on the way home, then a little tiny Bluetooth speaker in my kitchen, then the big speakers in the studio, the small speakers in the studio, my TV, just to see how it translates. And yeah, I think we got it right. And then it was mastered by Simon Gibson at Abbey Road. The soundtrack was, so he did an amazing job on the actual the soundtrack masters as well. So it's great working with Simon.
So I wanted to ask you about 007 Bloodstone.
Yep.
Because a lot of James Bond games, usually they take the theme, the 007 theme, and it basically just gets remixed to death for the game. Now, you didn't really do that, right? So, I mean, you kind of did an original score, but you kept it kind of in the style. Was that always the approach?
Yes. Now, I don't know the exact reason behind it, but as far as I have been told, the reason that we basically couldn't use the James Bond theme by Monty Norman throughout the score is because Bloodstone is an original story. It's not taken from a film. So I'm pretty sure it's something to do with the license. We did use the James Bond theme at I believe on the credits where it plays in its entirety, and we re-recorded that. But that's the only time. So I was tasked with having to create a sort of almost familiar sounding score without ever using that theme, which was quite a challenge. But it had to sound like it comes from the same sound world. And I think for myself as a composer, I mean, I studied a lot of jazz when I was at music college and university, and I'm originally a trombone player, so I know that world very, very, very well. So it didn't come, you know, it wasn't a challenge to me to create that score, but it was kind of an interesting sort of feature that we never used it. We never went there. And like you said, some game scores, they would just plaster it over every single thing remix it and kind of do it to death a bit. And I think that ruins the surprise of when it does come in a Bond movie. But yeah, we wrote, I think I wrote, there's again one quite big theme in that, and then there's other themes as well. But it was a big full-on action score with a lot of the musicians that play on the movies. So again, a great privilege to be able to work on a franchise as big as 007.
Because sometimes I try to put myself in the position of the composer. I'm like, okay, what would I do if I was in their position? So in the case with 007, I would think, and if you didn't do this, then great, good on you. But I would use the original theme and then kind of tweak it so you can remove it, if that makes sense. Yeah, did you ever approach it in that way, or was it just a completely original palette and then maybe go and add in like the iconic stabs, like the brass stabs and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a completely original approach because I knew we couldn't use the theme in that specific way. We were only going to use it once at the end of the game, so I didn't even think about starting with that and sort of reworking it. And you know, like you said about the approach you might take and others might take if they were using the theme. So I just started with an original palette and came up. You know, I knew it had to be very brassy. That's part of the sound. Bond is a combination of sort of jazz and symphonic influence. So melded together, you get a lot of the brass playing a lot of the sort of slightly more jazzy chords, and then you get the strings adding the action element and the percussion, etc. And I wanted to keep those elements sort of, because they sort of make up that sound, and I wanted to keep those elements in there. But in terms of actually the writing, it was just completely original, starting from scratch, like I would in any other project. And going back to themes, that theme was actually written on the top deck of a London bus.
What? Really?
Yep, that's where I came up with that theme.
So what, you were just sitting there and that melody came to your head?
Yep. And I wrote it down in...
Oh, okay. And then do you record like a melody into your phone?
I actually wrote it down on the back of an envelope I had in my bag, and immediately, it's 8 bars long or something, the main body of that theme. I just scribbled it down, and then when I got back home, just recorded it basically into my sequencer so I didn't forget it. And that's how I did it. Honest truth. So
when you say you wrote it down, did you write the notes, or did you?
Yeah, I often write the rhythm and then the note names and scribble a few bar lines in, and that's basically how I do it. It's how I've always done it. I don't often have manuscript to hand. It's just my own kind of formal shorthand.
That's so cool that you do it that way. Because a lot of musicians these days would probably just get out their phone and then maybe hum some melody in their phone. Yeah,
I quite looking at something visual as well. I find that helps shape the melody. That's why I occasionally record something into my phone if I'm in a rush or something, but I find having something visual in front of me is a really good representation, because I can sort of start to see the shape, even though it's not notated in sort of manuscript form, if you like. It's still rough, but I can see the rhythmic elements, and I often use arrows. It sounds crazy, but I sort of use arrows up and down, and I don't know why I do it like that. I've never even really thought about it that much, but it absolutely works for me.
Oh, well, it doesn't matter as long as it works, right? Everybody has their own methods. Yeah. There's a method to your madness.
That's right.
So did you get any direction in terms of the 007 soundtrack? Like, say, if you compose something and then the audio director might be like, no, that's not James Bond enough. Make it more James Bondy.
No, not really. I think when I was hired for the project, I was, again, there was a demoing process for that, and I wrote 2 original tracks, an action track and a sort of more pensive exploration type stealthy track. And then I also, although the game's developer didn't ask for it, I re-recorded the James Bond theme because I'm pretty sure that would feature somewhere. And then I hired all the musicians that play on the movies and recorded that at Abbey Road. And then that was my pitch for the game. And then when I was hired, I believe that the people at Eon Productions checked that I wasn't going to do something crazy, and they gave the thumbs up. And then it was left up to me, and I didn't have any cues rejected at all. It was just straight out of the gate. So that was a great experience.
I'm surprised that you still have to do demos, given your resume. Like, I'm surprised that you'd still have to. People, I would think that people would just hire you based on your name at this point. They might be like,
maybe.
Richard,
I think.
Yeah, we'll just hire him.
I think it often it's if I'm working with a new client and having a new collaboration, that tends to be where it is. Where if it was someone I've worked with before, then there probably wouldn't be a demoing process. But certainly with a new client and a new relationship with an audio director, I don't particularly mind doing it. And a lot of the time there'll be at least 15 composers on a pitch for a big sort of AAA title. So I think it's part of the process to show what you as a composer, your individual take on a brief or a project might be, and to have something to listen to is sort of often easier to make the decision by the audio director rather than just resume. And I like the fact that hopefully my music speaks for itself in the way I sort of present it and the way I, put my own emphasis in whatever the brief or the project may be. So yeah, it sort of swings and roundabouts really. I think it's probably 50% of the time I do, and the other 50% I don't have to. So do whatever's needed.
Yeah, well, you seem to be a master of melody. You're very, very good at it. I mean, a lot of composers these days, I feel they might compose something, but it sometimes feels like music's just there for the sake of being there, and it's just there to kind of stir a bit of an emotion, but it doesn't really have a memorable melody. But that's not the case with you. Do you go out of your way specifically to make sure of that, or is that just something that comes naturally to you? The whole melodical process.
I think it does come very naturally to me. I don't particularly know why. I started started learning the piano when I was 5 years old, and then trombone when I was 7. And I guess playing trombone as a solo instrument and in an orchestra, when you're playing in an orchestra, you don't often get melodies on trombone, but you do get a lot of the meaty brass stuff, and especially some of the big symphonies and the big Russian composers, etc. But then as a trombone soloist, it's a lot, mostly melody. So that's possibly where I get it from, and also playing piano as well and studying jazz. I don't think I do it consciously. I mean, there's some parts in both Guardians and 007 Bloodstone that don't require melody. I'm not saying every piece of music I write has a melody in it, because that would kind of be a bit too much, I think. But there's always melodic threads in there, even if it's presented as a piece of underscore, and even if they're not that obvious. I like to have a point to the music rather than it just being sort of a bit static. I think, I'm not one of these composers that would just do a sort of what I would call a musical sound design score. That's not really something that appeals to me, to be perfectly honest. And I think that melody is important still. It's still a very valid tool to have in a composer's toolbox to be able to pull out at the right moment. Again, not plaster it all over a whole score, but I do enjoy melodic writing, that's for sure. But then also when there's a piece of underscore or something just to set a dark tone or something like that. I love counterpoint as well. There's a lot of that in my writing. But it's, depending, it's really whatever is appropriate for the situation that you're scoring, I think is probably the best way to put it.
Yeah, fair enough. Now, was the plan always to become a video game composer? Because a lot of composers I talk to, they kind of fall into it. It's not something they intend, or when they started out, it wasn't even really a thing. How did you end up at SEGA, for example?
A bit by accident, really. So we're going back to the early to mid 90s, and I was just finishing up at university doing my music degree, and by chance, I'd always been playing games since I was a kid anyway, and during my teenage years and also during my university degree, I was hanging out in the studio all the time when I probably should have been writing essays about music history. But that was where I could naturally be found, is in the studio writing. It was mostly sort of electronic music at the time. And, as I said, being a gamer. And in those days when, like you said, it's basically Nintendo and Sega and some of the other Japanese companies like Namco and those kind of people were at the pinnacle of the games industry. There wasn't a huge amount happening in Europe or the US. There was a little bit, and especially on PC, but back in those days, it was the console kings that were reigning. And I wrongly assumed that a lot of it or all of it was done in Japan because of, we're talking cartridges here. This is before CD-ROM or disc-based media. We're talking cartridges. And I thought, well, I don't know how to get my music onto a cartridge. And I just assumed a lot of the music was done in Japan. But then, that big explosion in the mid-90s for consoles and PC gaming, that was just so huge. And in the last couple of months of my degree, I actually spotted an advert in a music magazine for an in-house composer at Sega in London. So I applied for the job and sent some demos in, and there's about 300 applicants, something like that. And then it went through 2 rounds of demoing. and then I got the job and moved to London. And the day after I finished my degree and started on the following Monday, it was that quick.
What? That's so cool.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it was
everything kind of
amazing.
just fell into place.
Yeah, I mean, it really did. I was still in the middle of doing my final exams, and I think I got the job in the May of was it 94, going back, and I was still doing my final recitals, and I said to Sega, can I just complete my degree because there's only 6 weeks to go, and they said, yeah, sure, no problem. So literally I got my results from university on a Friday, moved to London on the Saturday, and started Sega on the Monday. And it was that quick. And I spent nearly 8 really good years there working on a lot of their big IPs, and then went freelance after that. And the rest is history, as they say. But you're right, it was kind of a bit by accident. And yeah, I certainly wouldn't change it, that's for sure.
Because I would think at university they would teach you music more from a film or traditional music in terms of like pop music approach. I mean, because video game music was still relatively unheard of, and it's requires a different level of composing than say film or television or traditional music, right? So did that mean that you kind of had to flip on your head a little bit in terms of how you approached music when you first ended up at Sega?
Not really, because I mean my degree was a straight classical music degree, so although there was a small element of composition, it was more modern classical composition, which is something that has never particularly interested me. So I was always writing, let's call it media music, since I was a teenager. I was always thinking about music to picture, music to screen, music to games, whatever it was. I was thinking with that in mind. So the composition element of my degree, I didn't really need any of that for my career now. It was all about, I suppose, what I'd been listening to, what influenced me in my teenage years. We all have these formative years when we're listening to loads of kind of crazy different kinds of music. I mean, I was playing Stravinsky in the orchestra one minute, and then I was listening to Prodigy and Public Enemy outside of that. I mean, it's a really kind of crazy mix. But that sort of, I think, had an influence on my style and my career. And my degree was useful for working with ensembles. I would often write pieces of music just for myself, and then I was able to record them with the university orchestra and the brass band and the jazz band. So that was really good. That wasn't necessarily part of my course, but it's just something I was able to do and use the players that we had there and the studio facilities. So when I did come to sending demos into Sega back in the day, they were all recorded with live orchestra or choir or whatever, and I think that probably helped my gaining that role. I'm always one of those people that try to do the best with what's available and budget, etc., as I'm sure all composers know. But I think that was a good element of being involved in the sort of life at university when you're studying music, but also sort of not having to take everything from that and do it in that specific way, but like you said, learn when to break the rules and when to apply them.
So did any of those demos actually end up in any games, or are they just locked in the vault somewhere?
No, I have them on cassette in my lounge. They are definitely locked away. But no, there was. It was really just I wanted to demonstrate how I could do different styles. How that I got, hopefully got a really good ear. That's one of my strengths. My sight reading is still a bit rusty these days. But to be able to work at different styles, because a company like Sega, make everything from driving games, fighting games, platform games, and I wanted to show a range of styles, which was kind of key for those years. Now I sort of focus mainly on orchestral and electronica and sometimes jazz, but that's and crossover between the three rather, but that's mainly what I focus on these days. But in back in the day, being flexible was really, really important, and I still sort of remind myself of that today.
So at this point in time, is there any genres that you haven't dabbled in that you'd like to work in?
I'd like to do. I mean, I'm a big fan of old analog hardware synths, and I would love to do a score that's purely synth based. I think that would be really interesting to do,
That would be
both
cool.
in terms of textures and melodies. Would I even use melodies and something like that? Possibly, but that might not be needed. So something like that, I think, would be really, really interesting, just to sort of have a different approach to using hardware and using built-in sequencers and arpeggiators rather than sitting in front of Logic for another 4 years. I think that would be really, really interesting. And I think if I did something like that, I would approach it differently to how I have done on previous projects. I think I would actually do a lot of improvisation and record audio directly into Pro Tools and do it that way rather than sitting in MIDI land, if you like. I think that would be cool. I think it'd be a challenge, and I think that would really push myself. But I want to, I definitely want to fire up the synths pretty soon.
Because how do you stay inspired? Because I would think the longer you're a musician for, the more your canvas, so to speak, if you think about filling it up with different types of musical palettes, how do you continue to keep that original? Because you don't want to do stuff that you've already done before, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me personally, I mean, I still listen to a lot of music, and I still study symphonic scores even to this day. I've got a huge collection of miniature scores that I always go back to, whether it's a symphony or a concerto or a piece of choral music. I find that I can always find something new in those great works from the masters over the years, whether it's a texture or an orchestration color or a tonality. So that the combination of those two things, when I'm listening to new music, and I don't just I very rarely listen to scores, because I'm doing that every day, and there's only so much you can do. But just a new band or a new artist or whatever it may be. I mean, I do listen to a lot of electronica and things like that outside of my day job, if you like. So I think that keeps any composer fresh, or any person in the creative arts fresh, by just having absorbing new sounds or sights or those kind of things to sort of refill that sponge that we all have, because we're kind of constantly outputting. Every day when I'm writing, I'm constantly outputting. So I think we also have to input as well as a creative people. I think it's really important to do that. So yeah, I try and get inspired by many things, with movies, art, getting out to the country, whatever it may be. And I find that does help. And also just sort of improvising as well. Before a major project starts, I'd probably have a couple of weeks just kind of messing around with some ideas and tonality and rhythmic ideas and things like that. And I find that also helps. So a number of things, but you're right. It is important to try and stay fresh. And I'm still loving every minute of this crazy ride that I'm on. And I'm still getting inspired by many things. And I hope that continues.
So I kind of have a two-part question here. So in regards to your time at SEGA, because back in the 90s, everything wasn't so specific like it is now. So usually you get assigned an audio director or a composer. But back in the 90s, the composer might also be a sound designer, might do all the mixing and all of that as well. So the first thing I wanted to ask is, did you do a lot of that stuff? And in terms of like your modern day production, do you sometimes try to blur the line between music and sound design?
To the first part of the question, yes, absolutely. I had to do a lot of additional work. So sound design, sound editor, dialogue recordist, script writer, mixer, implementer. I mean, there was one game I did where I wrote 31 original music tracks in all completely different genres, and I wrote the entire script in 3 languages, and I recorded it all, edited it all, implemented it all, recorded 30 car engines, implemented that into the game, and every single sound effect you hear in the game. So every audio asset I made, with apart from a couple of singers and a few voice actors, and that was a very, very large amount of work.
Yeah, I bet. But in terms of like the script part, you said you wrote in 3 different languages. How would you?
Yeah, I had a there was a Japanese speaker in the office that was helping me with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I should have said that. I don't speak fluent Japanese or all these other languages, but I had to make it work for specific locations because this particular game was set it was the game featured the accurate representations of London, San Francisco, and Tokyo. It was a racing game, so I was writing all these weather reports and traffic reports and trying to get the locations right and the kind of cultural references correct. So. Yeah, that was I think the one game that I did literally every single audio asset on. To the second part of the question, these days, yeah, I mean, I just compose now. I hadn't ever studied sound design or anything like that, and as the things have evolved, there's some incredibly immersive sound design that happens in games, and I wouldn't ever like to do what those guys do because they are absolutely incredible at it, and my focus has always been music and composition. Sometimes I do my own music implementation, so I would actually author the files and implement it into the game myself. And then sometimes game companies have their own people on the team that would implement the music. But it really depends on the size of the developer and the size of the project. But I quite like getting my hands dirty and actually implementing my own music because when I'm writing, I have a specific idea of how it can be replayed back in the game. It's not a question of simply making a stereo file and saying please play that file. It's a whole nother level of interactivity that I try and bring to a project, and that's one of the really attractive things about games because it is challenging in that respect, and I absolutely love that challenge. And how are we going to make this particular scene sound absolutely seamless even though it's made up of 27 component parts for let's say a 1 minute scene? How are we going to make that work with all the player choices? So that's something I do really enjoy.
Because obviously there's a CD version, like say of Guardians of the Galaxy, right? There's the version that's on the album in terms of the musical piece. But did you write many iterations of most of that stuff because of the implementation? It might work differently. Like you might have to do 5 different versions of the same theme because it ends in a certain spot or has to end within a certain frame, so to speak.
Yeah, it's not necessarily different versions of the same thing, but it's how it plays out. So the album, I actually spent about a month just editing that together because there are lots of very, very short cues, which hopefully you can't tell when you listen to the album. Okay, that's great. Mission accomplished. But in the game itself, you might get a scene where there's a conversation between 2 characters and it's an interactive conversation. So let's say every 20, 30 seconds, the player has a choice to choose one dialogue option or the other, and then of course that branches into sometimes about between 16 to 20 options and different branching points that then converge back at the end of the scene. So I have to think as a composer, okay, well, if they choose option A, then that brings up another piece of dialogue, but that piece of the story is slightly different to option B, so the mood might be slightly different. So I would score those completely individually, so that there could be 20 or 25 individual short pieces of music that once they're linked together will be seamless into, let's say, a 1.5 or 2 minute conversation or a scene in the game. But depending on which path the player takes and which choices they make throughout, the music will be different for each branch of that particular storyline, but it all has to work together as one, and it has to be key and tempo related and implemented in a way that it sounds seamless. So it's quite complex, but it's good when it works.
Wouldn't that get confusing? Would you have to have like something pierced on your wall? Like, okay, so how many versions of this theme am I doing?
Yeah, the way I did this one, and every game's different because every developer has their way of doing this, but in a way it was really beneficial to have worked on Mass Effect because Mass Effect has often about 6 choices on the dialogue wheel. And that was, a brilliant experience to get under my belt as a composer, because when it came to Guardians and the developer said, we've got choice wheels, and I was like, I know exactly what to do. So it was absolutely fine. But for this particular game, yes, what I did is I had the script on a Word document, and in the document it says, you have section A, and then if the player has if the player makes choice 1, then go to section B. If player makes choice 2, go to section C, and then sections B and C will branch out into 2 of their own individual choices as well. So the only way I could figure out to have a look at it, to have it in front of me, was making a big, huge flowchart, which was they would average about a meter and a half long. And I would just stick a whole bunch of paper together on my table, and then I would actually make flowcharts for how this piece of dialogue was progressing, and then how they converge back at the end, and what the end result is. So most of the dialogue in the game in these type of scenes, it has a start point and an end point, but in the middle it can go many, many different ways, and therefore those pieces have to be scored individually. They don't necessarily have to be, but that's what I chose to do, because I wanted the mood to be completely correct with what the dialogue was and how the story is unfolding.
So a Mass Effect, was it similar to that, just 10 times worse because of the
Mass Effect? We use quite a lot more. Yeah, we use quite a lot more loops in Mass Effect because the tone was quite similar. It was just the dialogue was slightly different. But in Guardians, the tone does differ, and it takes you in a slightly different point in the story. So to get the mood right, it was really important that I did those scenes and scored them each one individually. Whereas Mass Effect, even though there was a lot more choices, they were quite similar in tone. So we used more loops and short stings and things like that. So it's more a question of reauthoring the same content or similar content in different lengths and things like that. It wasn't as complicated as it sounds, but Guardians, I certainly wanted to sort of push myself and make sure the game is properly scored depending on what the player choice is in a particular scene. And I'm glad I went to those lengths. It might sound a bit crazy, but I think the end result is what it's about. And I've been playing the game just this last week, and I'm happy that I made those decisions, because when I'm making a choice in the game, I know that it's going to be scored perfectly to the dialogue.
There's so much complexity to composing that so many people don't know. That all this stuff behind the scenes that you have to do, it's not just a simple matter of like, oh yeah, I'll just compose a piece and that's that, move on to the next thing. So many things involved, so many pieces moving, which I suppose you don't really have to worry about when you're doing television or film, right? It's just pretty straightforward. You just scored a picture and then done, really.
Yeah, I mean, working in linear media, you get, you've got a lot of time pressure and you might get constant edits, but that is part of the process. Games is very different. It is a lot more complex, and I like to put, a huge amount of effort in to make sure when the player is playing this game that it all perfectly works, and it's a seamless experience, even though it's completely interactive. There's no excuse for having music that poorly segues, or you find it jarring when there's one piece of music and then they start another piece of music. That's just not acceptable. And a lot, depending on the type of game I'm working on, a lot of the time I work in layers as well, and that's not submixes of instruments. That's actually recomposed music sitting on top of each other to change the flow and change the intensity. It depends on how you want to do it, but there is a lot of complexity. But that's one thing that I absolutely thoroughly enjoy about working in games.
Well, hey, I'll wrap up there. Richard, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for taking time out to do this. This has been a pleasure. I've learned so much about the complexity of composing, for one. You're very welcome. So where's the best place where everyone can follow you and keep up to date with your work?
I'm on social media. I'm on Twitter at Richard_Jacques. And on Facebook, I'm on Richard Jacques Composer. And I think I'm on Instagram at Richard Jacques Composer as well, or my website, richardjacques.com.
Cool. All right. Well, you know where to check them out. That is the show, everyone. Make sure you share, like, and subscribe. And until next time, stay safe.